time and again, the government has shown that they have this capacity to crack down and the will to use bloody violence. So this time around, they seem to be using the same. I don't know how long they can continue, both the protesters and also the security forces that are cracking down on them. It's hard to speculate, but so far they've just shown incredible bravery, courage, over 2 months of ongoing protests, and essentially risking their lives.
Iran's players declined to sing their national anthem before their World Cup match with England this afternoon in an apparent expression of support for the protests against their government. Some fans shouted and jeered during the anthem. Others held up signs saying, "Women, life, freedom." There's been a brutal crackdown on demonstrations in Iran, which began after Mahsa Amini died in custody after she was arrested for allegedly breaking the strict rules around head coverings. Human rights activists have said more than 400 protesters have been killed and more than 16,000 others arrested. Well, let's get more on this from Negar Mortazavi, who is an Iranian American journalist, a political analyst, and host of the Iran podcast. Good evening to you, Negar.
Good evening.
Thank you very much for joining us. What did you make when
Thanks for
you
having me.
what did you make when you saw those Iranian players refusing in a very public protest to sing the country's national anthem?
Well, it was incredible. It's a very public protest and also a very brave one because essentially by some hardliners in the country, it's seen as a sign of disrespect to the entire system, to the national anthem, and they seem to be not singing it in unison. So all of them remain silent, and this with you could visibly see the sign of grief or anger in their faces. And then just before that, in the press conference, the captain of the team said that they're grieving with Iranian families and essentially showed a solidarity and said that the team stands with the Iranian people. So it's been a long journey for the team. There's been a lot of pressure and a diversity of opinions from the fans as far as what they should do, whether they should even be present at the World Cup. Some tried to lobby the FIFA to get them banned. But I think at this point, I'm hearing more chants of support from a lot of fans saying essentially they're using this international platform and the spotlight to show solidarity and essentially shed light on the plight of the protesters in their country.
Yeah, because the Iranian regime has been doing everything it can to suppress the demonstrations, to prevent word of them spreading out. Although, of course, word has been coming out through people like yourself and, of course, through social media. But this is using a very public international platform to make their views felt. Has there been any reaction from the Iranian government?
It really is a very bold way, although subtle, essentially they just didn't do anything. They stood there in silence. It seems as a subtle way of signaling, but the message was received by both the fans and the regime. I haven't seen serious reactions from the regime yet, but I can expect that government officials will be commenting on this. I'm sure private messages have been received by the team. They're doing this at great risk, to their careers and potentially even to their own personal safety, those who have families in Iran, those who live in Iran, because the regime also understands this is an international arena and all eyes are on these players at these events. And essentially, they wanted them to pretend like nothing is happening. They wanted them to just be out there joyous and happy representing the country, and that essentially didn't happen. So they broke the messaging that was expected of them by the government.
And do you think that they will face any kind of reprisals, any kind of action from the regime once they return home afterwards?
It's difficult to say. I think it's a very fine line that they're essentially balancing. The fact that they did it in unison, essentially all 11 starting players united, I think there must be some previous coordination by them did this. It makes it stronger, also lowers the risk if it, as opposed to one individual player doing it, or the fact that the captain who was sitting next to the coach, the Portuguese coach Carlos Queiroz, in the press conference opened his talks by showing solidarity, essentially sending a message that trickles down to the rest of the team to feel a little more comfort or freedom in expressing. But it's hard to say. In the past, there have been messages like this, subtle or not subtle, and athletes have had to deal with repercussions. But then at the same time, I want to point out that this is not the first time, and these are not the only ones. We've seen incredible courage from especially female athletes who were the rock climber and Nazra Kabi who refused to wear hijab when she actually went into an international competition. That was huge, huge. And then she returned to the country to a hero's welcome of a lot of fans. So the other athletes have paved the way for these players. And the national team is also very popular. They essentially have celebrity star status, which gives them more power. They have this massive social base, which in a way gives them a bigger cushion of safety, but then at the same time, it puts them in a more sensitive and visible position when it comes to the government pressure on them.
And tell us, Nagar, a bit more about what is still happening inside Iran, because I'm seeing reports that up to 30 anti government protesters were killed by security forces in Kurdish areas of western Iran. That's according to one of the human rights group. This appears to be yet another crackdown.
Indeed. So protests have been continuing more than 2 months since the beginning in late September with the death in custody, essentially killing of Mahsa Amini. And in some ethnic areas, protests have been going even stronger in some larger cities due to the brutal and violent crackdown. Protests have been moving in different pockets, and you had we've seen different groups and demographics, and essentially an intersectional community of protesters joining in from university students in various universities across the country to school children, high schoolers, even younger girls, some boys, and also lawyers, teachers, and then these ethnic areas, especially the Kurdish region where Masa Amini was originally from, Gina Amini from the city of Saqqez, and where protests essentially broke out from her funeral and started. It's still happening, and the repression, the crackdown by the government in these ethnic areas is even more brutal, more violent, and human rights organizations have documented over 350 deaths so far in the entirety of the country, and 15,000 protesters have been arrested. A few of them, a number of them, have been handed the death penalty, and others also face very harsh sentencing, as we've seen by the government in the past.
It does seem extraordinary that, despite the risk of being killed by the regime, these demonstrations are continuing. I'm seeing also some reports of large protests in the north of the country with uh, government buildings attacked. Do you think that there is any prospect of the regime softening its stance on things like the rules over how women conduct themselves, what they must wear in public, and so on?
Well, it's difficult to say what these protests will bring. You know, some of these protesters are saying essentially that this is a revolution and they want to see an end to the entirety of the regime. Some are having more tangible demands, like chanting against the mandatory hijab. The morality police is essentially asking for the dismantling of the morality police. It depends on which part of the population or demographic you're talking to, but it's difficult to predict because at the same time the regime has shown the will and the capacity to crack down on protests in the past. In 2019, mass protests against the government in dozens of cities across the country, and very brutal crackdown, essentially an iron fist that was used with hundreds of protesters killed, thousands arrested, handed harsh sentences. Before that, 2016, 2017, also mass protests in 2009. So time and again, the government has shown that they have this capacity to crack down and the will to use bloody violence. So this time around, they seem to be using the same. I don't know how long they can continue, both the protesters and also the security forces that are cracking down on them. It's hard to speculate, but so far they've just shown incredible bravery, courage, over 2 months of ongoing protests, and essentially risking their lives. These women, young girls, and allies risking their lives and everything by staying on the street and facing bullets and batons.
And given the defiance of the Iranian regime, their apparent willingness as far as we can see so far, just to continue this utterly brutal suppression of the demonstrations. Do you think that those gestures of defiance at the World Cup will they embarrass the Iranian government, or do you think they will just simply continue along the course that they seem set upon?
Well, I think it has embarrassed them, but then also because it's a subtle message, they'll try to twist it with their own monopoly on internal domestic broadcasts and media to their own supporters, to their own base, their own constituents. So depending on which pocket of the population you're looking at, there's going to be different messaging and different understanding of this. But I think to the protesters and really to a big portion of the Iranian population, the message was received, it was understood. People have watched it again and again over their own outlets and channels, and I think the message was received by both sides. Would this bring change to the actions of the government? I don't think this is going to be that big watershed moment, but I think the protests themselves and the fact that these superstars, essentially these athletes, have eventually joined the protesters is going to have long-term impact for sure.
And just finally, Nagar, it wasn't a great start on the pitch for the Iranian team. How closely are ordinary Iranians following the World Cup? It is as big a contest test there as it is here in the UK and in well, some parts of the United States?
It wasn't, as you're saying, and I must emphasize that their morals are at an all-time low because there was just so much pressure on them, on the team, from all sides, from the government, the regime, and also the fans with their diversity of views of what they should do, how they should show solidarity. And I think this game, I'm not a soccer expert, but this game against England was the toughest of their group. So it definitely didn't come out to a good start, but it's obviously the most popular sport in Iran, in the country, especially among the young population. Everyone is watching it. This is the biggest event, the biggest athletic event in the world. And just the fact that Iran makes it to the World Cup is news in itself in Iran. So I don't think there's going to be celebration per se when they're scoring, when there's even winning of any future games, but just the fact that they made it to the World Cup and now they're using the platform to show solidarity, I think has been pretty good for a lot of fans that are watching them.
Negar Mortazavi, Iranian American journalist, a political analyst, and host of the Iran podcast. Really good to have you with us tonight. Thank you very much indeed.